Here's something most men refuse to accept until they've lost enough times to finally pay attention. It's not about being the richest man in the room. It's not about being the best looking. It's not even about being the nicest or the most attentive. You've seen it yourself. A woman has options, genuinely good options. Men texting her, complimenting her, trying to impress her. And somehow she chooses one specific man. Why him? Why does she consistently overlook men who are objectively more successful, more available, and trying harder? The answer is pure psychology. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Most men are competing on the completely wrong level. They compete with money, with attention, with gifts, with availability. But she's not choosing based on a checklist. She's choosing based on how a man makes her feel. About herself, about the connection, and about where the relationship is going.
Thalpi, pause. This is Liza from Secrets Inside the Mind, and today I'm breaking down the 3 core psychological reasons why she chooses one man over everyone else, and what most men are doing that quietly disqualifies them before the real decision is even made. Engagement. Siekie Nur 1, around 1 minute. If you've ever watched a woman choose someone who seemed like the wrong choice when you were right there doing everything right, subscribe right now. Because this video reveals the psychological reality of how female choice actually works. Keep watching until the end because the final psychological principle is the most important one and the one most men spend their entire lives missing. Section 1, the psychology of female choice. Why logic has nothing to do with it. Before we break down the 3 core psychological principles, you need to understand the foundational reality of how female attraction and choice actually operate, because most men are working from a model that's fundamentally incorrect. From a psychological perspective, attraction is not a logical calculation. It's not a checklist where the man with the most boxes checked wins the selection. Attraction is a felt experience, emotional, subconscious, and generated by psychological signals that operate beneath conscious awareness. She doesn't sit down and decide to be attracted. She feels it. And what generates that feeling is almost never what men think it is. Here's the psychological reality. Most men think attraction is about impressing her. They think the goal is to demonstrate enough value, enough success, enough attention, enough effort that she decides they're worth choosing. But this model has a fundamental psychological flaw. When you try to impress someone, you're implicitly communicating that you see them as the higher value party. You're positioning yourself as the one seeking selection. And that positioning, regardless of everything else you do, communicates something at a subconscious level that quietly undermines attraction. Here's the psychological principle that changes everything. She's not choosing the man who wants her the most. She's choosing the man who feels most emotionally solid. Not perfect, not the most successful, not the most attentive, the most psychologically grounded, the one who feels complete without her, the one whose emotional state doesn't depend on her responses, the one who is clearly going somewhere in life with or without her presence. Understanding this psychology is the difference between men who compete for her selection and men who naturally become the obvious choice. The 3 principles I'm about to share aren't about tactics or performance. They're about the psychological reality of what generates genuine female choice and why most men never access it. Section 2. Principle number 1. Don't compete. Position, the psychology of perceived value. The first and most foundational psychological principle is this. Stop competing and start positioning. And understanding the difference between these 2 psychological orientations changes everything about how you show up in every interaction. From a psychological standpoint, competition in the context of dating is the orientation of a man who believes he needs to outperform other men to earn a woman's selection. He sees other men as threats. He thinks about how to impress her more, how to be better than the competition, how to prove his superiority. And this competitive energy, subtle as it often is, communicates something at a deeply psychological level. I believe I'm in a lower position, and I'm trying to work my way up. Here's the psychological problem with that communication. Attraction grows when a woman feels like she's entering your world, not when you're scrambling to enter hers. The man who competes says through his energy, "Pick me, I'll prove I deserve you." The man who positions himself says, "This is who I am, this is what I value, you're welcome to join me." One is seeking selection, the other is selecting. And psychologically, the dynamic between those two orientations is completely different. Here's a real-world illustration of this psychological distinction. She mentions she's been talking to several men. The competitive man immediately feels threatened. He starts trying to differentiate himself. "I'm not like those guys. I'd treat you differently. You won't find someone like me." What does this communicate psychologically? That he's scared of the competition. That he sees himself as potentially losing. That her options matter to him more than his own confidence. The man who positions himself responds completely differently. He might say simply and calmly, "That's good. You should take your time." And then he moves on with the conversation. What does this communicate? That he's not afraid of options, that his confidence isn't conditional on her exclusivity, that he has enough self-possession not to compete with men he's never met. Here's the psychology of why that response is more attractive. It signals emotional security. And when she encounters emotional security, genuine behavioral emotional security rather than performed confidence, it triggers curiosity. She starts wondering why he's not worried. What does he know that the others don't? Why does he seem so settled in himself? And that curiosity is the beginning of genuine interest rather than the managed interest she gives to men who are clearly trying to win her over. From a psychological standpoint, positioning is built on standards. When you have genuine standards, things you actually won't tolerate, preferences you actually maintain, values you actually live by, and you express them calmly without apology, you create psychological respect. Not by being demanding or difficult, but by demonstrating that you have a sense of self that exists independently of her approval. Here's the psychological paradox at the center of this principle. The man she chooses is usually the man who seems complete without her. Not uninterested, not distant, not cold, complete. He enjoys her company. He values what she brings, but he doesn't need her to feel whole. And when she senses that she's adding to an already full life rather than filling an empty one, the dynamic becomes genuinely attractive rather than psychologically heavy. Section 3. Principle, Factor 2, Emotional Steadiness. The rarest quality in modern dating. The second psychological principle is emotional steadiness, and this is perhaps the most underestimated quality in male attraction psychology. Because most men only maintain their confidence when things are going well, very few stay confident when things are uncertain. From a psychological perspective, emotional steadiness is not about hiding emotions or pretending not to care. It's about having a stable emotional baseline that doesn't dramatically shift based on her behavior. It's the difference between enjoying her warmth without becoming dependent on it and panicking when it's temporarily withdrawn. Here's what the absence of emotional steadiness actually looks like behaviorally, and be honest with yourself about whether you recognize any of these. Your confidence level rises and falls based on how quickly she responds. You overthink messages that are slightly shorter than usual. You replay conversations looking for signs of reduced interest. You become more available and attentive when you sense her pulling back, which is the opposite of what psychology suggests you should do. You need reassurance periodically to feel secure about where you stand. Here's the psychological impact of these behaviors. When your emotional state visibly depends on her behavior, she feels it as pressure. She realizes that she has to manage your emotional experience, that her warmth, her responsiveness, her availability are all inputs that directly determine your psychological state. And that responsibility is heavy. It feels like emotional labor, and attraction doesn't grow in the presence of emotional labor, it contracts. From a psychological standpoint, women are extraordinarily attuned to emotional shifts in men. She notices when the confident, relaxed energy of early interaction starts to change. When a man who is calm begins texting more frequently, when someone who is focused on his own life starts becoming increasingly available, when someone who had standards starts making exceptions, and each of these shifts communicates something. His confidence was conditional. It was performing well when the situation felt secure. Now that there's uncertainty, the performance is breaking down. Here's the psychological distinction that matters most. Emotional steadiness means your energy doesn't dramatically change as your feelings grow. You can genuinely like her and still remain calm. You can care deeply and still maintain your routine, your friendships, your purpose, your direction. The depth of your feelings doesn't destabilize your psychological center. From a practical standpoint, this is built through one fundamental psychological shift. She has to become part of your life rather than the center of it. When your purpose, your goals, your friendships, and your own sense of meaning are all operating robustly and independently, when her presence enhances something already solid rather than defining something that's empty without her, your emotional steadiness becomes authentic rather than performed. And psychological authenticity is everything. She can't consistently distinguish performed confidence from genuine confidence in a single interaction. But, over time, across multiple interactions, across moments of uncertainty and difficulty, genuine emotional steadiness is unmistakable. And it's that sustained behavioral emotional steadiness that generates the deepest form of attraction and, ultimately, committed choice. Engagement, CTA number 2, around 12 minutes. If you're recognizing your own patterns in what I'm describing, comment below right now. Tell me which aspect of emotional steadiness you need to develop most. Like this video if it's giving you genuine psychological insight. And subscribe if you haven't, because the final principle is the most important one of all. Section 4. Principle number 3, direction over desire, the psychology of a man with a mission. The third psychological principle is the most challenging to hear and the most powerful to understand. She doesn't choose the man who wants her most. She chooses the man who is most clearly going somewhere. From a psychological standpoint, desire is common. Every man who's pursuing her wants her. The hunger isn't rare. It's the baseline of the competition. What's genuinely rare and what creates a completely different psychological response is direction. A man with a clear sense of where he's going in life, what he's building, what he values, and what he's willing to invest his energy in. Here's the uncomfortable psychological truth. When a man's primary focus becomes a woman, when he's thinking about her more than his goals, adjusting his schedule around her availability, letting his productivity fluctuate based on her interest level, he communicates something she can feel without it ever being said explicitly. His life doesn't have enough gravitational pull of its own. She's filling a vacuum rather than joining a journey, and psychologically, filling a vacuum feels heavy. It feels like responsibility rather than attraction. It feels like she's sustaining something rather than participating in something. Attraction grows when she feels like she's joining a moving train, something that's already in motion, already generating momentum, already going somewhere compelling, not when she's being asked to be the reason for that motion. Here's the psychological reality of desire without direction. When your mood improves, only when she gives attention. When your motivation spikes when she's engaged, but flatlines when she's distant. When your discipline and focus are obviously contingent on her interest level. You're revealing that your life revolves around her rather than the other way around. And no matter how much she likes you, that psychological revelation changes how she sees you. From a Stoic psychological perspective, this connects directly to purpose. A man who wakes up consumed by a genuine mission, by goals that have nothing to do with impressing anyone, by work that matters to him independently, by a vision of who he's becoming, carries a different energy than a man whose daily orientation is organized around securing female approval. Here's what direction looks like behaviorally rather than verbally. You don't always have time immediately available because you're genuinely engaged in your own life. Your schedule has actual structure that you protect. You have conversations about your goals not to impress her, but because they genuinely occupy your mind. You make decisions based on your own values, rather than adjusting constantly to whatever she seems to prefer. Your sense of progress is measured internally rather than by her responses to you. Here's the psychological impact of direction on female choice. When she senses that you're building something, that you're moving forward regardless of what's happening in your dating life, she starts to feel something specific. She wants to be part of what you're building, not because you told her to, but because forward momentum is inherently compelling. People want to align themselves with things that are going somewhere. Here's the final psychological insight about direction. It changes how you handle every form of uncertainty and difficulty in the connection. If she pulls back, you don't collapse because your sense of forward motion isn't dependent on her engagement. If she's uncertain, you don't beg because your worth isn't tied to her certainty. If things become unclear, you don't become anxious because your life continues moving independently. And that psychological stability, rooted in genuine direction rather than performed confidence, communicates something she can feel across multiple interactions. This man is going somewhere with or without me. And that realization, when she genuinely feels it, is one of the most powerful generators of genuine female choice. Section 5, the psychology of being chosen. What all three principles create together. When positioning, emotional steadiness, and direction operate together, when they're not performed but genuinely lived, they create a specific psychological profile that generates what most men spend their entire lives trying to manufacture through tactics. From a psychological standpoint, what these three principles collectively create is emotional certainty. And emotional certainty is the real answer to the question this video started with: why does she choose him? She doesn't choose the most impressive man. She doesn't choose the most persistent man. She doesn't choose the man who competed hardest or demonstrated the most effort. She chooses the man about whom she feels emotional certainty, the man whose presence feels solid, grounded, and stable enough that she can genuinely invest in him without the anxiety that he'll crumble under pressure or become someone different when the relationship deepens. Here's the psychological breakdown of what each principle contributes to that emotional certainty. Positioning communicates psychological self-sufficiency. She's joining something rather than being begged for. Emotional steadiness communicates reliability. She won't have to manage his emotional experience or be responsible for his psychological stability. Direction communicates forward momentum. She's aligning with someone who is going somewhere, not waiting for her to give his life meaning. Together, these three psychological qualities create a man who feels rare, not because he's performing, not because he's using tactics, not because he's following a strategy, but because he's genuinely developed the internal qualities that generate attraction rather than seeking external validation to compensate for their absence. Here's the uncomfortable psychological mirror this holds up. If you've consistently been in situations where you're doing everything right but still not being chosen, the honest question is which of these three principles has been absent from how you're showing up. Were you positioning or competing? Were you emotionally steady or reactive? Were you living with direction or organizing your life around her availability? Those honest answers are where change begins. Section 6, the psychology of growth, becoming versus growth. Performing. Here's the final layer of psychological honesty that most dating content never addresses. The difference between becoming the man who gets chosen and performing the behaviors of that man is psychologically enormous, and she can feel it. From a psychological standpoint, performed confidence and earned confidence feel fundamentally different at the level of sustained interaction. Early in a connection, performance can be convincing. But over time, across moments of uncertainty, difficulty, and genuine testing, performed psychological qualities break down while earned ones sustain. This is why genuine growth is the only sustainable strategy. Not tactics, not scripts, not short-term behavioral adjustments designed to create a particular impression, Genuine development of the 3 psychological qualities that make a man the obvious choice. Positioning gets built by genuinely developing a sense of self that doesn't require her approval, by working on your values, your standards, and your willingness to hold them calmly and consistently. Emotional steadiness gets built by developing a life rich enough in purpose, connection, and meaning that she's genuinely an addition rather than a center, by actually having goals that engage you, friendships that sustain you, and a daily experience that doesn't require her presence to feel worthwhile. Direction gets built by actually building something, by making consistent progress toward goals that matter to you, by developing genuine momentum in your professional, physical, and psychological development. None of this is fast. All of it is real. And the man who does this work doesn't just become more attractive in relationships, he becomes more psychologically complete as a person. The attraction is a byproduct of genuine development, not the goal that development is organized around. Here's the final psychological paradox. When you stop organizing your development around being chosen and start organizing it around becoming complete, you naturally become the man who gets chosen. Not because you've learned how to appear more attractive, but because you've become someone whose psychological presence is genuinely compelling. That's not a tactic. That's a life. And it's the only approach that creates sustainable results, not just in dating, but in how you experience yourself and how you show up in every significant relationship in your life. Final section, the honest challenge. Let me end with the psychological honesty that most content in this space avoids because it's uncomfortable. If she didn't choose you, it's not because she was confused. It's not because she chose the wrong man. It's not because women don't know what they want. It's because she didn't feel emotional certainty about you specifically. That's hard to hear. But it's psychologically true, and it's the only starting point for genuine change. The good news is this. Emotional certainty is not generated by being a particular type of person. It's generated by genuinely developing the psychological qualities that communicate groundedness, stability, and direction. And those qualities are buildable. They're not genetic. They're not about circumstances. They're about consistent psychological development over time. When you become the man who positions rather than competes, who is genuinely emotionally steady rather than conditionally confident, and who is clearly going somewhere with his life, you stop asking why she didn't choose you. You start becoming the man the decision is obvious for. And that shift from seeking selection to becoming genuinely selectable is where everything changes. Final engagement CTA around 25 minutes. If this video gave you genuine psychological clarity about why female choice works the way it does, comment below. Be honest. Which of the 3 principles has been most absent from how you've been showing up? Tell me what you're going to change, like this video, if it shifted your psychological understanding of attraction and choice. Share it with a man who needs this perspective. And subscribe to Secrets Inside the Mind, because this is the depth of psychological insight that actually changes behavior, not because you've learned better tactics, but because you've understood the underlying psychology clearly enough to develop something real. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.